Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are conducting a bit of an autopsy. I guess you could call it that.
That's a good way to put it.
The Patient is a genre that, a lot of us grew up loving, one that really defined our childhoods and for a long time just completely dominated the global box office.
We are talking about fantasy.
Yeah. Sword and sorcery, dragons, knights, the whole package.
And this is the place where we don't just skim the headlines. We read the footnotes, we read the sources, the angry commentary, so you don't have to. And if you've turned on a streaming service in the last, 5 years?
Oh, yeah.
You've probably noticed that The Patient isn't doing so well. The vital signs are, let's say, weak.
It's so ironic, right? Because on paper, you'd think fantasy is bigger than ever. We're talking billion-dollar budgets for things like the Rings of Power.
Unprecedented budgets.
We have the Game of Thrones universe expanding in every direction. We've got The Witcher. But the general vibe from the audience, it's not excitement anymore. It feels like exhaustion.
It is. It's what people call franchise fatigue, but I think specifically within this genre, it feels more like cynicism.
Cynicism fatigue. I like that.
We've seen this massive influx of content, yet the cultural conversation has shifted from, oh my God, did you see that amazing episode? Something more like poignant.
Or how did they mess this one up?
Exactly. How did they get it so wrong?
And that is exactly what we're digging into today. We're working off a very sharp, very provocative critique by a cultural commentator known online as the Critical Drinker.
He doesn't pull his punches.
No, he does not. The piece is titled Make Fantasy Heroic Again.
Yeah.
And our mission, I think, for this deep dive is to try and answer a really fundamental question. Why does so much modern fantasy feel so compared to the classic?
And we're not just talking about, bad CGI or a few plot holes. Those are definitely part of the converse sometimes. We're looking at a deeper philosophy, a move from what you could call heroic adventure, think Lord of the Rings, the original Star Wars, to this grimdark nihilism.
Right.
We're going to look at why Hollywood became so obsessed with subverting expectations and whether, that obsession has actually killed the very thing that makes fantasy work in the first place.
Yeah. And before we get into the really heavy stuff, the nihilism, the girl bosses, as he calls them, the deconstruction, we have to start where the source material starts. And it's surprising because it actually starts with a moment of hope.
Which is very rare for this particular commentator. If you follow the Critical Drinker, he's not exactly known for his sunny disposition when it comes to modern Hollywood. He's usually, let's just say, aggressively skeptical.
That is a very polite way of putting it. The source material literally opens with him confessing that he sat down to watch the latest Game of Thrones spinoff, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, with a punt of rum in hand. He was preparing to anesthetize himself for the experience. He was ready to hate watch it.
And that's such a common sentiment now, isn't it? The whole concept of hate watching.
It really is.
We don't tune in to be entertained anymore. We tune in to see how they messed it up this time. It really speaks to the level of trust that's been broken, I think, between creators and the audience.
Absolutely.
When you sit down with a drink just to get through an episode of a show you supposedly like.
Yeah.
That's a toxic relationship.
It is. But then the plot twist happens. He says, and I'm quoting here, I found myself actually looking forward to it. He put the rum down. He actually enjoyed it.
Wow.
And I think that reaction is our Rosetta Stone for this entire discussion. Yeah. Because if we can figure out why this specific show felt so different, we can identify what's been missing from everything else.
Okay, so let's break down the why. What did A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms do that, say, The Rings of Power or The Witch? The source identifies a few key elements, but they all seem to circle back to one kind of unfashionable concept. Simplicity.
Simplicity. That feels like a dirty word in TV writing rooms right now, doesn't it? It seems like everyone wants to be the next The Wire, but, with dragon. They want these incredibly complex political machinations.
Right. But the source points out that this show just strips all of that away. You have a protagonist, Sir Duncan the Tall. He's not a secret king. He's not some political mastermind with a 10-step plan.
He's a hedge knight.
He's a hedge knight.
And for those who aren't super deep into the lore, a hedge knight is basically what? A freelancer with a sword? And he's so poor, he literally sleeps under hedges.
That's where the name comes from. Precise. He's at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. But the key trait the source highlights isn't his poverty, it's his nature. He's described as good.
Just a good guy.
A good guy on a quest to simply make something of himself. He wants to be a better. That's it. That's the motivation.
And he has a sidekick, Egg, who's described as funny and endearing. It sounds so basic when you lay it out like that. It sounds like, a Saturday morning cartoon setup.
It does. But the source argues that this basic nature is exactly why it works so well right now. It's a palate cleanser.
A palate cleanser from what, though?
Think about the mental load that's required to watch most modern fantasy shows. The source directly critiques shows that are labyrinth-themed political epics.
I know exactly what he means.
If you need a relationship flowchart, a map of 3 continents, and a history textbook just to understand why character A is stabbing character B in the back, that's not a source says that's homework.
Homework is the perfect word for it. It feels like a chore. And he explicitly mentions the relief of not having to track 500 different point of view characters.
Yeah.
But it's not just about the complexity of the plot, right? It's the tone. And this is where we really get into the visual and the emotional language of modern fantasy.
You mean the Grimdark aesthetic?
Exactly. He describes the competition shows like House of the Dragon or parts of The Witcher as relentlessly grim, somber, pretentious tales. And he uses this great metaphor. He says they move as fast as a morbidly obese glacier.
That paints a very, very vivid picture. It implies this immense weight, but not in a good way. It's not gravitas. It's a narrative that's swollen and sluggish and just stuck.
You can feel the drag, can't you? Miserable people, skulking in dark rooms, whispering about politics. It's oppressive. And the source points out that A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms actively rejects that. It has, in his words, an underlying feeling of
And in this climate, optimism is the rebellion. It feels like a radical act.
It does.
And that connects to a really specific critique the source makes about world building and modern diversity standards, which is, always a hot button topic.
Right. And we need to navigate this part carefully because it's obviously a very polarized issue. The source uses the term DEI instructional video. Now, regardless of where you stand on the politics of that, we have to look at his storytelling art. What is he actually criticizing from a narrative standpoint?
He's criticizing what he sees as a copy-paste approach to world. His argument is that in many of these modern shows, every single village, every town, every city, it doesn't matter if it's in the frozen north or a southern desert, it looks exactly the same demographic.
Okay.
It creates what he calls a united colors of Benetton that, in his view, erases any sense of a unique juror or sense.
So the argument is, if everywhere is diverse in the exact same way, then nowhere feels like a real distinct place. Breaks the immersion because it feels more like a corporate mandate than an organic world that grew over time.
That's the core of his critique. It flattens the world, makes it feel homogenous, and he contrasts this with the show's handling of, physical reality.
Yeah.
He praises the show for avoiding that common trope of
I know we're going to
the 100-pound teenage girls beating up armored men twice their size without breaking.
Yes. The physics-defying fight scenes. Which brings us back to that word, grounded. The show feels physically and emotionally grounded. But the most important takeaway from this whole section, the thing that really seemed to shock the source, was the morality.
The moral compass of the story.
Yeah. He says the show knows the difference between good and evil and isn't ashamed of it. That phrase, isn't ashamed, that really stuck with. Why would a storyteller be ashamed of telling a story?
Because in the current literary and Hollywood climate, clear-cut morality is often viewed as unsophisticated. It's seen as childish or simplistic. Exactly. Naive. If you went into a writing room today and pitched a story about a genuinely pure hero fighting a genuinely pure villain, you'd likely be laughed out of the room. They would tell you it lacks nuance.
Right. Where's the gray area?
It's not reflecting the complexities of the real world. And that very urge to reflect the real world is what the source argues is the infection that's killing the entire genre.
Okay, so we've established what good looks like, according to him. Optimism, simplicity, clear morality, a sense of adventure. Now we have to look at the bad, the diagnosis of the illness, and the source brings receipt.
He brings a whole list, the rogues gallery of modern fantasy.
He lists them off like a criminal record, the Wheel of Time. He just says, look at the state of it.
Yep.
Willow, the sequel series, The Rings of Power, The Witcher, and he lumps them all together. He isn't saying they're all low-budget B movies. In fact, he acknowledges they are incredibly expensive productions. They have smart writing, or at least writing that thinks it's smart.
Right, writing that uses big words and complex sentences.
Yeah, but he calls the final viewing experience empty and unsatisfying.
And that's the disconnect, isn't it? It's between the technical proficiency on one hand and the emotional resonance on the other. You can spend $200 million on a CGI dragon, but if the audience doesn't care if that dragon lives or dies, you've completely wasted your money.
He calls it a failure to move the audience on a deeper emotional level. The whole thing is sterile. He brings up the Willow sequel specifically with a quote from the show that I think just sums up the pervasive cynicism.
What's the quote?
It's a line exchange character. One says, I'm here because I can't act, and the other replies, neither can I.
Ooh, savage. But it points to a feeling that these productions are more like assembly lines than genuine art endeavor. The source frames his whole commentary as this stream of conscious critique because he feels there's something deeply wrong with the genre's DNA right now.
Okay, so if we accept the premise that the genre is sick, we have to find patient zero. Where did this infection start? Because it wasn't always like this. We had Lord of the Rings in the early 2000s. We had Harry Potter. Those were earnest, hopeful stories.
They were, and according to the source, the infection, or maybe the paradigm shift, can be traced back to a single massive cultural phenomenon, Westeros.
Game of Thrones.
There's no escaping it. It is impossible to overstate how much Game of Thrones changed the entire... And the source is very clear about this. He doesn't say Game of Thrones was bad. In fact, he calls it phenomenal.
It was. I remember watching that first season, and I think a lot of our listeners will too. When Ned Stark, well, spoiler alert for a show that's over a decade old.
I think we're safe.
When Ned Stark lost his head at the end of season 1, it was a cultural earthquake. It felt like every rule of storytelling had just been broken.
It completely shattered the monomyth, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. You know, it teaches us that the hero enters the abyss, faces the great danger, and returns transformed.
Right.
Ned Stark entered the abyss and got decapitated. The end.
It taught us, as an audience, that plot armor was a lie. And the source says that at that specific time, this is exactly what we needed. Traditional fantasy had become a bit stale.
It had.
We're getting tired of the farm boy who's secretly the chosen one and can never really be hurt. We wanted real danger. We wanted unpredictability and genuine stake.
Game of Thrones was like the punk rock response to the classic. It was dirty, it was mean, it was irreverent, and it was shocking. But, and here is the absolute crux of the source higher argument. While that approach worked for Game of Thrones, it taught the rest of the industry the absolute wrong.
Okay, let's unpack those wrong lessons, because I think this is where we really get into the why of the current state of things. The source argues that Hollywood looked at the success of Game of Thrones, and they didn't see great character drama with tragic elements. They saw nihilism set.
They fell headfirst into what he calls the grim reality trap. The idea that to make fantasy mature or adult, you have to drag everything and everyone down into the mud. You have to debase it. You have to remove all the hope.
It's the death of heroism. In this post-God-T era, if you introduce a character who is honorable, or kind, or genuinely brave, they're marked. They're portrayed as an idiot who doesn't understand how the real world works.
They're prey. In this worldview, virtues are weaknesses. If you try to be honorable, like Ned Stark, you die. If you're a backstabbing Machiavellian sociopath, like Littlefinger, well, here, have a kingdom. For a while, anyway.
It creates this horrible feedback loop of cynicism. The source argues that the ultimate message of so many of these shows becomes the world is a horrible place, good and evil are just, perspectives, and people aren't worth saving any.
Which is a profoundly depressing message to consume for entertainment. It's draining. And it deconstructs the very purpose of the hero in the first. A hero is supposed to struggle against the dark. In these modern shows, the hero often is the darkness, or at least a slightly lighter shade of gray.
And it's not just depressing, it feels smug. The source talks a lot about smug deconstruction.
That is a key term here, deconstruct. Now, in literary theory, deconstruction means taking apart a trope or a concept to see how it works, and often to expose its internal contradictions. It can be a useful tool. But in modern Hollywood, as the source sees it, it's often used as a weapon. Writers want to show that they are smarter than the material they're adapting. They want to be the cool kids in the back of the class who point out that, Aragorn's tax policy would probably be a disaster for Gondor.
Right. And who cares? That's not the point of the story. And that connects to a quote from the source that really hits home for me. He says, "Cool isn't very deep. Cool is nothing more than surface level flash."
That's a great...
It's easy to be cynical. It's easy to sneer at a hero in a white cape. It's actually really, really hard to write a hero in a white cape and make the audience truly believe in him and root for him.
Because sincerity requires vulnerability. From the writer and the audience, irony is a shield. It's a defense mechanism. If you write a sincere, hopeful story and people laugh at it, you feel stupid. But if you write an ironic, cynical story and people don't like it, you can just say, oh, you just didn't get the satire. It went over your head.
It's cowardice masquerading as intellect. And this obsession with cool nihilism leads us directly to the source's main case study for everything that he thinks is wrong with the genre today. The successor to the throne itself, House of the Dragon.
If Game of Thrones was the initial infection, the source argues that House of the Dragon is the terminal stage. He argues this show took the moral grayness of its predecessor and doubled down on it to a truly detrimental...
He goes so hard on this show. He calls it a slog. Crushingly slow and relentlessly grim. And honestly, thinking back on that first season, does anyone in that show ever smile? Like a genuine, non-evil, non-scheming smile.
I am struggling to recall one. And the source points out a really specific narrative structural failure here. He focuses on the death of King V's at the end.
Paddy Considine, who gave an incredible...
An absolutely fantastic performance. But the character of Viserys served a vital structural purpose. He was the anchor. He was the only genuinely good, or at least genuinely well-meaning person in the entire room. He just wanted peace. Family, flawed as they were.
And once he died...
The anchor is gone. Yeah. The story is adrift. You are left in what the source calls character vacuum. He describes the central conflict of the show as Group A of unlikable selfish assholes versus Group B of unlikable selfish assholes.
This is the fundamental problem with total moral ambiguity.
Yeah.
If everyone is gray, everything just turns to sludge. Who am I supposed to root for? Why should I care who sits on the Iron Throne at the end?
Precisely. Why should the audience invest emotional energy in the conflict between Rhaenyra or Alicent if the show goes out of its way to show us that both of them are willing to do terrible things for power? The stakes, they evaporate.
Yeah.
If there is no good outcome possible, there's no real tension. It's just waiting to see which horrible person dies next in a horrible...
He uses this analogy that I thought was just brilliant. He says, watching House of the Dragon is like watching a robot paint a perfect copy of the Mona Lisa.
That perfectly captures that soulless quality he's critiquing. The technical skill is undeniable. The costumes are perfect. The set design is immaculate. The lighting, well, when you can actually see it, is autistic. The acting is high caliber.
Of course.
But it's a simulation of human drama rather than the real thing. It feels like it was created by an algorithm designed to replicate the success of Game of Thrones. It lacks the spark. It lacks a soul.
It's hollow. Oh, and I just have to mention this. Purely as a side note, because it was so blunt, he takes a very direct, very personal shot at George R.R. Martin.
He does indeed. It seems the general frustration with the delay of the books has reached a boiling point for him.
Yeah, he basically yells at the screen for him to finish The Winds of Winter.
Yeah.
Calling him well, let's just say he questions his work ethic and his physique in some very colorful language. I believe the exact words were, "You fat, lazy F."
It definitely captures the frustration of the fan base, that's for sure. But moving on from Westeros, the source argues that this infection, this grimdark nihilism, it didn't stay contained there, spread. It came for the sacred text. It came for the rings.
Now, you can't get more opposite to nihilism than Tolkien. I mean, Tolkien was a guy who fought in World War I, saw the absolute worst of humanity in the trenches of the Somme, and he came back and wrote a story about how the smallest, most insignificant person can change the course of the future. His work is fundamentally about hope.
Which is why the dissonance in the Rings of Power is so jarring to fans like the source. He argues that the showrunners tried to apply the Game of Thrones filter to a world that philosophically rejects it. They tried to make Tolkien edgy and complex.
So let's look at the specific examples he gives. First, the character assassination, as he calls it, of Galadriel. In the lore, and even in the Peter Jackson movies, she is this ethereal, wise, ancient, compassionate figure. She is almost angelic. She has overcome temptation.
And the source describes the Amazon version as a brutal, bloodthirsty warlord girl boss.
Girl boss is a term that gets thrown around a lot, often in bad faith.
Yeah.
But what does he specifically mean by it in this context? What are the traits he's pointing to?
He means a female character who adopts what are traditionally seen as toxic masculine traits: unthinking aggression, arrogance, a complete lack of empathy, and is then framed by the narrative as strong because of that. He notes that this Galadriel seems perfectly willing to sacrifice her own soldiers for personal revenge. She acts like a spoiled brat, in his words, in the court of Numenor.
So it's a fundamental rewriting of her nature. They tried to make her complex by dragging her down into the mud, but he argues they just made her unlikable and unrecognizable.
Exactly. And then the orcs. This part of his critique actually made me laugh because it's so absurd when you say it out loud. The show tried to humanize the orc.
Yeah.
In Tolkien's mythology, orcs are corrupted beings. They are essentially biological robots created by pure evil for the purpose of destruction. They don't have families and mortgages and dreams of opening a bakery.
Right. But the show tried to introduce this idea that maybe they're just innocent, peace-loving family men who are just looking for a homeland.
Orcs just want a backyard and a barbecue. It's so ridiculous. It's applying a very modern, very specific post-colonial theory to a high mythology where it just doesn't fit. And then we get to the biggest offender of all, Sauron, the Dark Lord, the literal manifestation of evil in that world.
The necromancer.
Oh, deceiver.
Reduced, according to the source, to a sulky, emotionally incontinent incel.
And an incel because he has a crush on Galadriel. Is that the argument?
That's a huge part of it.
Yeah.
The show framed his motivation, at least in part, through his romantic rejection by her. When she rejects his offer to rule together, he gets sad and then turns fully evil. It completely trivializes the concept of cosmic primordial evil.
It really does. If the devil is just a sad guy who got friend-zoned, he isn't scary anymore. Pathetic.
It destroys the mythic quality. It brings the epic down to the level of a high school drama. And that seems to be the recurring theme. We are constantly trading myth for modernity. We're trading epic for soap opera.
And we see the exact same pattern in The Witcher, which the source lumps in with all the others. He says everyone in that show is also a morally gray ass.
And that confusion for the audience just creates apathy. The source mentions that in The Witcher, it's often genuinely unclear who you're supposed to be rooting for from one.
Everyone is betraying everyone else constantly. And he levels a very specific critique at the writer's room there regarding their treatment of the female characters. He brings up the invincible girl bosses again, but adds another layer about identity politics.
Right. He claims the writers seem to prioritize checking boxes, specifically, in his words, making characters gay, over crafting coherent characters.
Now, to be clear, his argument isn't necessarily against inclusion itself, but against what he sees as the prioritization of identity markers over good storytelling. He argues that the writers seem more interested in turning these characters into representatives of modern social groups than in making them interesting, believable individuals within a fantasy.
It feels engineered, not created, like it came from a memo.
That's the feeling he's describing.
Okay, so we've established the symptoms, the grimdark tone, the unlikable heroes, the trivialized villains, the clumsy allegory, but we still need to answer the really big question. Why? Why are these writers, who are smart people, who are paid millions of dollars doing, why is there this bizarre urge, as he calls it, to reframe good and evil and blur all the lines?
The source has a pretty clear theory on this. He calls it the Hollywood mindset. And it basically boils down to a massive confusion about the fundamental purpose of the genre itself.
So they've forgotten what fantasy is for.
They seem to have forgotten that it's called fantasy. The source argues that writers today, especially in Hollywood, believe that everything, even a show about elves and dragons and wizards, must reflect the current political and social climate of, say, Los Angeles in 2024.
The mirror approach to art. They think if their show isn't directly commenting on modern politics, then it isn't saying anything important.
Exactly. But the source's counter-argument, the real world is messy. The real world is often tedious and depressed. The entire point of Fanescape not to wallow.
That makes perfect sense. If I want moral confusion and depressing political deadlock, I can just turn on the news. I don't need it in my dragon show.
He argues that these modern writers are employing clumsy allegory instead of genuine imagination. They're trying to lecture the audience on current events rather than transport them to a different world entirely. And this brings us right back to the writer's ego, to that shield of irony.
Explain that psychological aspect a bit. Why is irony a shield? What is it protecting them?
It's protecting them from judgment, because sincerity is vulnerable. If you write a story about a hero who is genuinely good, who stands for truth and justice and hope without a single hint of irony, you're opening yourself up to being called cheesy, dated, or worst of all, naive.
And in the current Hollywood culture, being called naive is like a death sentence. You have to be edgy. You have to be subversive.
So they deconstruct, they tear things down, they say, look how smart I am. I know that heroes are actually problematic and that kingdoms are built on oppression. It's a defense mechanism. The source's point is that it is infinitely safer to smugly deconstruct someone else's great work, especially a classic work by a dead author, than it is to put your own sincere, heroic, hopeful creation out there to be criticized and possibly mocked.
That is a profound point. It is so much safer to tear down than to build up, which explains why so many of us are just starving for something real, something genuine. And this is where we pivot to the light at the end of this very long, grimdark tunnel. There's one show that bucked the trend, one show that did everything wrong by modern Hollywood standards, and yet it was a massive success.
The exception that proves the rule, and that's One Piece.
The live-action adaptation. Now, we have to acknowledge, live-action anime adaptations usually suck. They're almost always terrible.
Cowboy Bebop, Death Note,
Right.
The List of Disasters.
It's a graveyard. So everyone, myself included, expected this to fail spectacularly.
But it didn't. And the source holds this show up as the solution, as the antidote. He credits its Japanese origin. He makes a specific note saying, leave it to the Japanese to preserve the things we've lost sight of.
So what are those things? What does One Piece preserve that The Witcher or Rings of Power lost?
First and foremost, a genuine sense of adventure, sincerity. The protagonist, Monkey D. Luffy, is not morally gray. He wants to be king of the pirates, sure, but he is fundamentally a good person who helps. He cares deeply about his friends.
He smiles. He laughs. He's not brooding in a corner about his tragic backstory.
Exactly. And the show doesn't try to reframe its world as a bleak, morally gray hellscape. It embraces the weirdness, the color, the optimism, and the hope. It doesn't apologize for being a rebel.
And what was the audience response to this earnest, optimistic adventure?
Universal praise. It was a huge hit. And the source contrasts the feeling of optimism, of positivity, of its moral heart, with the feeling he describes of forcing himself through an episode.
It's the difference between being recharged by a story and being drained by one. One gives you energy, makes you feel good. The other takes it away and leaves you feeling exhausted and cynical.
And that leads to his final point, his tentative hope for the future. He wonders aloud if the trend that started all those years ago with Game of Thrones is finally ending.
Are we seeing the turning of the tide? Is the pendulum swinging back?
It's possible. The success of One Piece and the potential he sees in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms suggests that audiences are voting with their time, and Hollywood might finally be realizing that fantasy should be an escape from the tedium of real life, not a boring, preachy reflection of it.
That maybe, just maybe, it's okay to have real heroes, that we actually them.
It is a provocative thought. And as we close out this deep dive, I think it raises a really important question for everyone listening.
What's that?
Well, we live in challenging times. The real world is often very difficult, very complicated. So when you sit down at the end of a long day to watch, what do you want from it? Do you want to see a perfect reflection of all that difficulty steeped in cynicism? Or do you need a reminder that courage still matters, that good can triumph over evil, and that adventure is still possible?
Are you feeding your cynicism or are you feeding your hope? That really is the question.
Indeed. It's about what we choose to nurture through the stories.
Well, that is a lot to think about. I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and a huge thanks to The Critical Drinker for the source material that really sparked this whole conversation. It was a fascinating look at the machinery of modern storytelling and maybe a sign of things to come.
It was a pleasure to break.
If you're feeling inspired, maybe go find a story tonight that has a real hero in it. Skip the gritty reboot for a night and watch something that makes you want to go on an adventure. We'll catch you on the next